we have a certain amount of time for questions. And Michael?
Thank you for both these talks. I want to try to loop them together, but first I wanted to go to Tim, and this reflects on something that Rod and I were talking about at lunch, right? Seems to me that Baldwin did write, you mentioned another country, right? Baldwin, another country is exactly the experimental novel he's talking about somebody should write, right? I often wonder why in Baldwin scholarship there seems to be this almost reaction, maybe he causes this, right, to skip past his actual, the artifact itself to go talk about it kind of theoretically as if he hadn't already written exactly this actual book that he's describing, right? And to what Alex, your talk, I was really curious and thinking so much about what's going on in these narratives, right? I was wondering if there's ever in the work that you're doing with these narratives regarding slave insurrection, how do you fit Benito Cereno into this argumentation, right? And just to cut to.
Thank you, Michael. We talked about this briefly as well at MLA, and it's a good question, and it's work I haven't done yet, and I think it absolutely has to be done. The way into this project was through this notion of the hypothetical novel, but as you say, Baldwin writes real novels, and but it's true that is part of the, part of the project that I haven't yet got to. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. My sense is when we sort of get to Benito Cereno, I think it's doing something very different than what Blake is doing. And I think particularly we can sort of locate that in how the two texts deal with the slave insurrection, right? And specifically what I mean is that Melville's story, it's the sort of like the charade is withheld the whole time. You're sort of taken along through it and you're sort of inhabiting the narrator's point of view, and it's this really, that's the sort of accomplishment of it, right? But where the text goes is that there's that reveal towards the end of like what has really happened, and for us as the reader, then we can sort of make sense of all of this, and then we sort of work backwards and we say like, okay, here's oh, this was all this is all being put on. So I think that's the key difference for me, is that Delaney doesn't ever let that happen. He doesn't ever let the revolution come into representation, but rather sort of, as I said before, kind of dangles it in front of you, and then doesn't want to show it to you. And so I think by not showing it, he makes a much more profound point about the impossibility of thinking this sort of thing. So I think that's maybe where to like start the difference, but I also am really interested in how Melville sort of recuperates that at the end of the text, where Benito Cereno is rendered mute and can't sort of speak or think ever again, right? And he follows his leader to his grave, right? Is the ending of that. So I think that like maybe to sort of like put it as schematically as possible, like Delaney and Melville kind of end up making similar points, but for me, I'm much more interested like formally in the way that happens in Blake, whereas I think Benito Cereno sort of pushes in another direction. Does that make sense?
No,
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I have a question for you, Alex. I was wondering, I'm intrigued in listening to you and thinking about how many of us are trying to come up with different terms for talking about something that the word trauma would have been used in the past, but that doesn't, that word doesn't come up, that apparatus isn't interesting to you. And I just wonder if there's a difference between the imperception referring to what, for lack of a better term, one would call trauma of the Middle Passage, a trauma of the past, and the kind of utopianism of of Blake. I mean, of a future revolution yet to come. Are those two different modes of unrepresentability?
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that question. One thing that strikes me immediately is the temporal dimension of trauma that I think separates. I mean, it's there, right? It's there, especially in Wheatley Peters. It's there, especially in Wheatley Peters, because it sort of names the source of trauma without going back into it, right? And so you're sort of thrown back into it as you're looking away from it. I think with imperception, and maybe this is sort of why I want to draw a distinction between what Melville and what Delaney are doing, is that there is no sort of like recuperative moment. It's just, you know, what Delaney is doing is kind of holding us in suspense, and so it's not that sort of moment, the flash of revelation, I think is how Melville puts it. There's no flash of revelation that then you go back and make sense of everything that has happened. But I think for Delaney to get to those utopian possibilities, or at least to point, I mean, it's like, right, like he doesn't, there are some really interesting scenes, especially towards the end of the novel when they're sort of like organizing the future political structure in Cuba. And people get these like fun titles like Captain General, and like it's all this, it's like a really wild political meeting is going on. I was thinking of like Amanda's talk, the sort of discussions and dialogue that people have. But so you get this sort of, you know, like some of these types of moments of what the future might look like, or what might lead people into a different future. But again, that sort of the, you know, the like radical break from the present is still rendered impossible. So you consciously get some thinking, but you don't get the sort of full representation of that. So I think I think that's sort of like how I would maybe distinguish it, is like there's this like really intense. I mean, this is certainly true for trauma as well, but there's the really intense present for thinking like Delaney and imperception, and then sort of like going back to Peters, there's a sort of like recursive return to the moment at the title, if that makes sense. Thank you.
I collected 5. Gabby?
Okay. I have a question for both of you. They are somehow related. And I'll start with Alex. I was also intrigued by the fascination with the trope of the unrepresentable, not only in this talk, but in general, theoretically. And you added the imperceptible. But then at a very interesting moment in your talk, you said literature makes the imperceptible legible, or something to that effect. And it points to me to the paradoxical nature of this trope, because in a way, if it can be made legible through literature, why is that not a representation? Why it's not so? Perhaps I'm also influenced by one of my students who wrote a book on Holocaust studies with the title Against the Unrepresentable. And so I wanted to ask you to say a bit more about that. And then for Tim, it was the categories, the unthought, you know, that you mentioned at one point. And later you came with the example of the dead in the closet. And that is something related, everybody knows, nobody talks about it. That would be, for me, very close to Polanyi's concept of the tacit knowledge. And I wanted to add a term by Christopher Bollas, the unthought known, which for him refers to very early formations in childhood. And I think the example that Bonnie gave in the morning of the child being outed for the way the child walks, and then they know suddenly, I'm different. That's not a sought knowledge, but a form of the unsought known. And I think these, those for me were the foundational ones. It was perhaps more the suggestion to also include the unsought known, but then I had one brief question to add when you referred to Vehelius' analysis of the bare life as yet another racializing assemblage. And I wondered at that moment, in Black studies, the concept of social death is totally central. What would be the difference between the concept of bare life as a racializing assemblage? Isn't then social death not also yet another racializing assemblage? So I'll stop here. I could always go on, but I have to.
You want to go first?
You would do? Who was the person that you mentioned who talks about the unthought known?
Christopher Bolas.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I mean, I'm very interested in these kinds of apparently paradoxical formulations of tacit knowledge, the unthought known, I mean, these are all, I think, deeply tied up with the concept of fiction and fictionality as a form, and then, in a way, the entire structure and organization of the literary as a kind of particularly as a historical and as a historical emergence associated with the aesthetic, and of course associated with the rise of fictionality. So I think those are they go centrally to what I'm trying to talk about, and to specifically make the connection then between, I mean, to make the connection between, which is not, I don't think it's not, I mean, I haven't completely worked it out. This is a project to connect the theory of the novel to the distinctively modern and not distinctively American, but largely American situation of endemic racial inequality. So those references are very helpful, and I will follow them up. In terms of social death, that's very interesting. I have not thought that relationship at all.
Only came to me now.
Yeah, well, it's extremely interesting, and I would have to think more about that.
Yeah. Me too.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really central one, and sort of gets at maybe something I didn't find space for in here. I think, like, to sort of make it as schematic as possible, I'm interested in lining up when literary texts represent something, I'm interested in lining that up with the senses, right? So when we, read something happening, he walked over there, right? There's a sort of sensory element to that. And I want to distinguish that from what literary texts can do via form, right? The sort of like submerged content type of thing. So I'm thinking in particular, right, like how legibility, right, to go back to your question specifically, how legibility does not become another form of representation is like the way that it can sort of get around this issue of appealing to the senses. It can sort of seed the idea in your mind without showing you directly. And so that's why I'm sort of making this, I was trying to make this distinction between, like when Marx is like, let's pull back the curtain and have a look, right? It's not quite that. It's not about pulling back the curtain and having a look. That's not imperception, right? It's rather trying to understand something that can't appear to the senses regardless. So that's the sort of social form of value, or the sociality of value. So for me, it's this way that, what can we do to not appeal to what can literature do that doesn't sort of have to get routed through the senses, through those types of representation, narration, those sorts of things. For me, that's where legibility doesn't turn into representation.
Can I, one very brief sentence?
Yeah.
It reminds me now your answer. Jeffrey Hartman once asked the question, why can't we look at ourselves without the detour of literature? And I thought it was a very interesting thing about literature as a form of indirection.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's along the lines in which you think.
Yeah.
Question from since you were keen at the outset to distinguish the imperceptible not with the visible but with the legible, I was wondering to what extent that made the imperceptible for you as you understand it and as you deployed it coincide with the idea of the implicit. Just because legibility is on the other side and making legible is kind of making explicit what is implicit. I'm just curious about the relations between imperceptible and implicit. And I've asked that partly because the examples you gave as having some significance for the idea were things like labor, and you were sort of channeling Marx. The implicit very often has this role to play of shaping what is conspicuous and explicit and so on. So, as as philosophers like to say, the conditions for the possibility of what is in the field of the explicit. So that's particularly why I'm asking how the imperceptible relates to the implicit.
Yeah.
And Timothy, sometimes, especially given the quote from Toni Morrison, I sometimes think, thank God for, just as you in some way were also hinting at, thank God for incoherence, partly because well, let me just, before I say why, one question is, how does incoherence relate to inconsistency or just contradiction? Partly because so much of what makes change possible is, if you take the grand narratives of Hegel and Marx, it's contradiction. We wouldn't have transformations of those large kinds unless there were contradictions. And so now I'm wondering, since we are in an inner intellectual field where grand narratives are being increasingly questioned, so we are sort of in a bricolage of what makes transformation possible. Something like incoherence, rather than blatant contradiction or inconsistency, is much more likely to have its. One of the things, when I say thank God for it, one of the things that one should fear the most is if what is noxious or let's say capitalism, whatever, is completely coherent. I mean, one of my great dreads is that I have to have a dialogue a moral dialogue of the kind you were talking about earlier today, with somebody whom I deeply disagree with, but who's completely coherent. I mean, there's no I can't have any way of saying, but see, you believe this, maybe you should ease up on this, but there's nothing. It's a monster of coherence, and that's the end of any possibility of this kind of malleability, which is the basis of transformation. So,
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I realized in the course of writing this paper, I think and I said this at the beginning, that every use of incoherence, including my own, is tied to a specific usage. So it's not a concept insofar as what I find extraordinary is Baldwin's use of the term in a highly specific context that is very different from our own in terms of the conversation around let's say around race and racism in America, where in a different moment racializing assemblages, I think, is a concept, and it's a way of conceptualizing and understanding what Baldwin at that moment was calling incoherence. I think he was not conceptualizing anything. I think he was doing it for rhetorical effect, and yet it's that. So this is why I think I'm not. I don't want to make of incoherence anything more than just this kind of citational relationship to this particular moment. But I share your despair at forms of coherence that are obnoxious and yeah.
Is it related to?
No, I thought, am I behind in the queue?
You're
Oh, okay.
next. You're next.
Oh.
Alex has.
Yeah, I'll just answer
Response.
briefly. Yeah. The distinction between imperception and the implicit. I think that pointing to the conditions of possibility is a good way of putting it. And I think that particularly because what I want to get at with imperception is how otherwise, like, let's just say invisible for the moment, invisible structures we can start to begin to understand invisible structures. I'm not sure that I'm thinking about value under capital. I'm thinking about commodity fetishism. I'm not sure that those things are implicit. I think there's a distinction between something being implicit and something being sort of like unavailable but structurally determining. So I think that there's a closeness in the terms, and I think maybe when we get into literature and when we get into literary form, there's this sort of like implicit relation that Delaney's novel has to Black Revolution, that it doesn't, right, is when you sort of put that in terms of implicit or explicit. But I think that, right, that's kind of where my understanding of that text in particular, that's kind of where that starts. Where it points to, I think, is that larger structural impossibility that I don't think sits implicitly in the text, but is pointed to through this, this type of legibility that I'm, or like, impossibility of perceiving, but maybe it's possible to read. So I think there's a distinction there. And just like one more way of trying to put this together, this, I like the thinking through the conditions of possibility because I'm really interested in trying to figure out what is the groundwork that makes perception possible in the first place, right? What are the conditions of possibility for perception? And so thinking through the text that I pointed to, I don't think that, enslaved labor is in a implicit relationship to that, but I think it's in a structural relationship, which for me there's some significant difference there. Yeah, but thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for these papers. I appreciated them a good deal. I have one question for each. I'll try to be efficient in asking them. So for Alex, it's a key part of your argument seems to sort of turn on this claim about slavery as a social experience not available to perception, an imperceptible sociality, right? And you carry that through the reading of the Delaney. But one thing that sort of, or a couple of things about that novel that sort of struck me as you were making that case, there are a couple of key moments in that book where the sonic kind of enters into the text in really powerful ways, right? There's the scene where Blake goes to Africa, right? And it pivots on this moment where a mixed race woman whose father is a European slave trader, her mother are African, who's sort of anguished about her like father's complicity in her father's participation in the trade and her own kind of implication, therefore, in the trade. And it gets expressed, her anguish about what's being done to her race and so forth gets expressed through this screaming, I believe. I can't remember the characters' names at this point, but I do remember the distinctive like emphasis on her scream.
Yeah.
Right. And it seemed that scream was supposed to sort of like convey something about, you know, the anguish of the trade itself, right? So it was a kind of sonic moment meant to convey something, right? And then the other kind of powerful way in which sound kind of is part of that book is like the when Blake is in the United States, right? He goes on this sort of like campaign to kind of rouse the slaves in the country, around the country, and he's sort of traveling around. And what he does is sort of like he almost engages in kind of like interview process with different slaves on plantations, and he makes them sort of like recount some of the kind of abuses they endure, right? So I'm just wondering, like, if you could think about a little bit about the sonic, like, as some place where it seems to sort of trouble the unavailability as such, right? So that's my question for you. And then Tim, my question for you has to do with, I appreciate this like focus on incoherence and the sort of effort to link that up, novel theory to some of these questions in Black studies. But the lingering question for me is sort of like about how you're positioning yourself in that strain of like American criticism that sort of like, to a degree, kind of embraced race and its sort of incoherent expression in the literary tradition. I'm thinking about, Ken Warren's Black and White Strangers, Eric Sundquist's To Wake the Nations, and Michael North's book, right, which someone mentioned earlier, like where minstrelsy becomes a kind of lingua franca across these different strains of Black and white modernisms, right, to bind them together. So just to say, like, I would like to hear you say something more about like how you're seeing your intervention here with respect to incoherence, speaking to that kind of established, body of critical literature that's trying to confront, like in complicated ways, the fact that the literary tradition has been shaped around Black and white writers trying to negotiate with the legacy of race. So, yeah.
So I'm going to intervene to say that if you guys would answer these, and then I'm going to collect the rest of the questions, and if we're left with simply the collection of questions, that's not a terribly bad way to end this wonderful conference.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the way that I would want to answer this is to look back at some of the stuff I was talking about with William Wells Brown and Clotel. The sort of like, if you think through the older criticism of that novel, it's that it was incoherent, right? Is that it's just this sort of like massive collection of, you know, stories from slavery, basically, that don't hold together in, you know, a neat narrative arc. And so in the past, the novel was sort of thought of as, you know, this, you know, not experimental, not interesting in that sense, but rather a failure because it couldn't sort of like hold together a single thread, right? And so I think that this like gets really centrally at the concern that I understand you bringing up, is that like the attempt to collect all those stories, right? Because that's sort of what Blake is doing when he's traveling around the American South. And that's sort of like one of these the ways that like one of the ways of thinking about what that novel does in the context specifically is that it collects people's experiences, right?
Right.
It gives voice to them, people who don't have a voice. And so, right, like it does that in this really direct way. And so I'm interested in kind of thinking about that, and of course, like the sonic representational nature of that, of people telling what it's like to live on this plantation, because those are the types of questions that he's asking. What is it like to live here? Do you get enough to eat? Those sorts of things. I'm interested in thinking about that as something that kind of, you know, pulls the form of the novel apart, right? That I want to sort of think about as necessary for how, you know, both of these texts work. And sort of gets at, you know, like one way of kind of thinking about what happens in either text when you're in these moments is, right, these sort of tangential narrative lines that, you know, just disappear. You go and then it's gone, and then you're sort of back to the main narrative. So I want to think about how that kind of pulls at what the novel can do in the 19th century, and how African American writers are playing with this idea of, you know, of coherence. So I think that's sort of like one way I would answer in terms of the sort of you know, that form of representation and how it plays into the sonic. I think, okay, yeah, I think the other part about the woman in Africa who has the sort of experience with her father being complicit in the slave trade. I like just to sort of like think through that very briefly, is the way that right, that's there is the scream, and of course I'm thinking of, right, Anne Hester's scream, and I'm thinking also of you know, when Douglas is thinking through the sorrow songs, and he says, as he's sort of recounting them and he's writing, he says like, as I write this, an expression of emotion is rolling down my cheek. That sort of way that he then goes back to an understanding of something that, right, he says he couldn't understand when he was, I think it's like within the circle, right? So I think like to understand that moment, I would want to think about the you know, the types of understanding that Douglas comes to there, and kind of think through that in the context of Blake. I think I mean, of course, there's the two work together on the North Star, and, you know, of course, Delaney was super familiar with Douglas's work. So I think that type of scream could be like rethought of through that, because the other part of that is after Blake leaves Africa, you don't see this part, but the implied next step of the narrative that happens in Africa that isn't included in the novel is that she's going to start like organizing a revolution there. So that's like the seed that he plants. So I think it's a really interesting moment that is really helpful to think about, especially in the other senses. Yeah, thank you.
And just for me, Roland, thank you for those suggestions. I think that's a super interesting question about, I mean, work that I, you know, don't know well enough, but the work that makes its critical basis analytical forms. I mean, incoherent forms, essentially. So I would love to talk with you more about that, but I think it's a really, helpful way that I would like to, go further. So thank you.
So I'm going to ask the following 4 people to ask their questions very efficiently. Erin, Maya, Adi, and Amanda. And I'm taking Amanda off, so Erin, Maya, and Adi.
I know we're out of time. I'm approaching incoherence, but I also want to doubt. I don't think I've ever fully arrived at incoherence, nor have I ever fully been coherent, and I think that's where I want to go. I had another question that you already answered, Tim, but I want to just go back to one of your first points, which is that concepts bring coherence. And I'm not sure that I agree with that in any strict or complete sense. In other words, if concepts bring coherence, or if we attempt to have them bring coherence, it's only in a temporary, provisional, contingent, haunting, defective, Jacques would say, exposed, as I would say, sense. In other words, there might be sort of a sense of coherence, but I think the most exciting political concepts that I've read and then that I've heard discussed today are those that do allow themselves to be haunted by some kind of incoherence. And it's just not a complete incoherence, just as there are many interesting ways in which form, experimental forms especially, can incorporate, respond to, play with formlessness without ceding completely to formlessness, without letting go completely. So, when we talk about an experimental novel, I think we're talking about form. We're not talking about the formlessness, right? We're just talking about an experimental form. So I just wanted to kind of say that, because I hoped it maybe would allow us to pull back and say, like, what have we been doing and what is the project doing? We talked at lunch, Adi, about, I think on the website, it talks about a project for the formation of concepts, and I was asking, about the role of deformation today, and I want to maybe think those together.
Thanks so much. I'll just say so briefly that I thought June Jordan's essay on the Wheatley poem could mediate these questions in a really interesting way, and sort of leading towards the question of imperceptible to whom and under what conditions. But let's talk more about that.
Adi.
So my question for Alex was, Maya asked the distribution of imperception in a given historical situation. And for Tim, I would like to say yes, there is an element of coherence in concepts, but it's always within a movement toward, and the whole element of performance is about this. And I would like to say something about your performance and the quest for coherency there. You started with a concept, you moved to coherence, and from coherence to incoherence. And then there were several steps. I do not recall all of them. So some were not presented as concepts, but as some kind of substitute or remnants or would-be concepts that were not conceptualized, but stand in something that stood in for concept. And then along the way, you arrived to racialized assemblage, racial or racialized assemblage, and then to America. And I wonder if what you did here was not an attempt to give us a concept of America. And that within this concept, there is one facet, like one facet of the concept, one way to look at the concept is incoherence. And then another facet is the novel. Because these three elements were like reflecting in each other in a kind of what sounded to me, as you read this, I think, very rich talk. They sounded to me like a monad with 3 windows. So you got quite close to a concept of America, or of incoherence, or maybe of the novel.
On that note, I think we should end.
Yeah. So it will be incoherent if we will not end with another. Thank you to all the people who helped us be there for these 2 days. Damien, Benjamin, Rachel, Gregory, Amanda. Thank you all for helping us to make this happen.